The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Welcome to the 2025 ELL Collaborative for Administrators at the Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University. Tennessee Department of Education, one of our very best partners. Ever since we started in 2017, they're here today. So Dr. Haley Richardson is going to lead the presentation, and it will be followed by a Q&A session with the panel of Joanne Runyon, Dr. Hannah Gribble, and Raven Cleveland. But Dr. Haley Richardson is going to take the presentation now. Thanks for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I am so thrilled to join you all this morning. My name is Dr. Haley Richardson, and I am with the Tennessee Department of Education. However, I have served in Tennessee schools for over 20 years, with my most recent time being in Rutherford County before coming to the department. So I come to you today talking from a space of experience and hopefully talking about things that are relevant to you as you are working in your buildings and with your folks who are supporting your students. So today we're going to talk about instructional coherence and English learners. And you may have heard already information, the terminology around instructional coherence. And our purpose today is to really frame out, what do we mean when we say instructional coherence? How do we create it? And what does it look like in spaces for our students as we execute on this idea of creating an instructionally coherent day? So as we broach this topic today, we're going to talk about high quality Tier 1 instruction. We're going to talk about the definition of instructional coherence and what it looks like. We're going to talk about what the day for a student may look like when we're talking about these spaces. And then we're going to work on the role of leadership and what that means as we're trying to build these coherent spaces and experience for our students. High quality instructional materials. So when we're talking about Tier 1 instruction, we're talking about a lot of moving parts and pieces. And all students are engaged in that Tier 1 space. So today, as we're talking about the role and the work of this, we're talking, yes, about English learners, but we're talking about English learners as all students. So when we're talking about Tier 1 grade level instruction, there are lots of pieces that we have to understand as we're thinking about supporting that space. First of all, we have to recognize that student engagement, that where they're coming into the instructional space, their current performance level, and the ask of the grade level standards are all pieces of consideration that you have to think about prior to ever providing instruction. So that means that we need to know, one, what our students can do. How are they positioned first to engage in the instruction? Then what spaces are we going to need to provide additional opportunities for support in? What do we know about the content that is going to be delivered that is going to provide challenge points for our students? What do we know about our high quality instructional materials that account for that challenge point and provide for us already? What access points are already built into the curriculum that are an opportunity for us to lean into and pull forward to engage our students who may not be as positioned to engage in Tier 1 instruction as other students, but still should be engaging in Tier 1 spaces? Then we have to know, what is the standard asking? And what skills are necessary for our students to have in place to reach that ask? Because without that knowledge, where do we even begin to target support and opportunity for access? All of these pieces are working together for a high quality Tier 1 instructional experience. That does not take into consideration, if you will, delivery methods. How does the teacher present the material? It does not take into consideration, on our little graphic, the students in positioning for interacting with peers. Those are also elements that are going to be present in your Tier 1 space that we need to consider and plan for. The onus in this space sits in planning. What high quality instructional materials have done for us is they have provided us a resource that your students are going to engage with, even our English learners. And now we're focused on planning for that opportunity. So the shift sits in, how do we plan for that engagement, for that learning, for that knowledge building? How do we make sure our students are able to access and engage in that space? So if we think about all of those pieces as elements of instruction, and we think about them as overlapping, any one of these pieces is important, and present by itself serves to work towards getting our students closer to that understanding. So we can have rigor of high quality instructional materials without solid teacher implementation. We can have high expectations of grade level standards without knowing what our students' present levels are. But when we miss those key pieces of understanding, the actual student experience begins to fall apart and miss where we want students to be. So that means that while they function independently, they don't function to the best of what we can provide for instruction with any one of these pieces missing. So a student who is sitting in an instructional space that has all of these considerations present is going to be better positioned to engage in the lesson, better positioned to have access to the materials, and better positioned to get closer to the outcomes and reach the outcomes that we want our students to be reaching. As you all are working with students, it's important that you understand this, because you're supporting that execution of this space. You're supporting the execution of access and how a student engages in these spaces. So it is critical that you too understand how these work together to really build on a student's experience and position students and our teachers to work collaboratively in this space to achieve what we're working towards. We cannot move forward with designing instruction without understanding where our students are starting from. And that starts with database decision making. You may have heard about this before, you may have seen this graphic before. But this starts with understanding student knowledge as they enter into the instructional space. What data do we have that tells us what our students currently know and where they sit in position to the expectation? When we know that, when we begin to gather and analyze those data and really dig into what those data tell us about our students' performance, then we can start to create a plan to implement to support our students in instructional spaces. And that is true in the Tier 1 space as well as other spaces of instruction. And we always have to be evaluating what we're doing. So this space of defining student progress and meeting expectation, analyzing the data that comes in, designing a plan, never ceases. It continues, it is cyclical, because our students are always going to be learning, taking in new information, and we're always going to be refining our understanding of our students' knowledge. Even if we're not sure if a student is moving, there are still decisions to be made. Because if we don't know if our students are making progress or not making progress, that's another series of questions that we have to look into, and we have to account for, and we have to create a plan for. All of this works together to help us as educators position and understand and recognize how to tailor instruction to our students' needs. How do we know where a student is sitting before they engage in the ask of the lesson so that we can think about the lesson, we can think about the content, and we can strategically plan for how we're going to help a student engage in those spaces. And this is where instructional coherence comes in. Instructional coherence at a system level and at a student level are the idea that what we are doing and planning for a day for our student makes sense educationally across a variety of spaces and is interconnected. What we mean is, if in one classroom I am presenting material that has no relevance to the rest of my student's instructional day, then what I am asking my student to do is own that knowledge independently of the rest of the day and build their own generalizations and transferability of that knowledge. That does not mean that the science content shows up perfectly in the English content, but it does mean that we're going to pull forward opportunities for creating spaces of connection in our days to help our students who are in all of these instructional spaces make connections to the information that they're receiving. When we're talking about systems level coherence, what we're talking about, and if you're engaged in A4A, you have already heard this messaging, is designing spaces that allow us to come together as teams to collaborate, to think about these instructional spaces and think about these opportunities and design, intentionally design instruction to meet the needs of all of our students. So really, we're talking about big picture, how do we build this process so that it becomes accessible at the student level? Because all of these things have to be in place for this system to function in the way that we have planned for it to function. And here's why. A second grade student is probably going to have a day very much like this. They're going to have an opportunity in their perhaps reading class to knowledge build, and maybe that's an hour where they're talking about birds or a unit around
planets.
Somebody said
I was just giving you something.
Yeah, planets. Okay, great. Planets. I'm sure your instructional material has that unit in it. Okay, so they're going to be building a large depth of knowledge on planets. Great, that's wonderful. Then they move to writing, but they're asked to write a personal narrative about their experience with their first day of school or maybe what they did over the weekend. Then they move into foundational skills where they're presented with decodable text that is about perhaps a cat and a dog and maybe a friend, and all of the words are sitting and positioned and perfectly chosen to build a new reader's access to reading, right? But it's sitting at a much lower level. And then they move to lunch and recess where they don't think about any of these things because they're busy eating and having a good time with their friends and playing. And then now we're asking them, okay, come back from recess, settle, refocus, mathematics, where we're going to be working on perhaps addition or subtraction. And then we're going to move to related arts, where they might have music or art or PE. And then they move to what we're going to call an intervention time that is designed to support all students And perhaps during this time, they're going to be receiving explicit reading intervention in basic reading. So again, working on decoding, but the decoding material that they're using has nothing to do with the decoding material that they used in their foundational skills. And may not even focus on the same elements of decoding. So perhaps in their foundational skills, they were working on digraphs, and now in their reading intervention, they're going to work on vowel sounds. All important, all very critical to building a young learner's understanding, but you can see already what their day might look like. And then we're going to provide them support through a direct service ESL setting. Okay. So this student, who is a second grader, who we know already has some challenges in engaging in content and in the instructional day, has had 7 transitions in their day. And each transition has represented a different educational opportunity that probably has nothing connected to the opportunity before it. So a student who is already having challenges, we're asking them to be flexible in their thinking, to attend each time we transition them to the material that we're presenting to them, and to be able to generalize knowledge from other spaces and take it back and forth between each transition. That's a pretty considerable lift. What does it look like for a middle school student? A middle school student's day may have less transition, but the lift doesn't change. So we're still asking for the same experience. We're still putting them into those classes, that coursework that is necessary to build their knowledge. But again, in their reading class in 7th grade, maybe they're reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven with a co-teaching model. Great, okay? But then they transition into social studies where they're talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, okay? Clearly, we're not making connections here. Then we have to transition into science where they're talking about the anatomy of a flower. Then we're transitioning into lunch, which is an opportunity to disconnect and perhaps connect with friends and just be a student in a space, a kid experiencing lunch, having a good time with friends. But we're also providing intervention during that time. That means that we're asking a student to, again, work with material. Maybe they're getting support for reading fluency. But the material that's selected to be utilized in this intervention space is not Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, because that's not their instructional level. So instead, maybe it is a text that is really at an entry point for this student, which may be at the 3rd grade level. Because we want them to be able to build their skills, we want them to have success, and we want them to experience in that space what it means to be a successful reader and to practice the skills that are obviously present in the text. But again, that transfer has to be able to be applied to all of these other spaces, but is it connected? Probably not. Then we move into related arts. Where we may begin to see a little fatigue starting to show up. So perhaps there are some behavioral challenges because they're tired now, because the brain has had to shift multiple times in the day to keep up with the demands of the instruction and of each transition representing in middle school often a different teacher with a different presentation style with a different set of expectations. So by the time they get to mathematics, which may be a favorite subject, they are no longer positioned to engage in the knowledge because they're completely worn out from the transition of the day. So it is possible that behavioral concerns start to show up that weren't present in the morning because of the effort that we have inadvertently placed upon our students to be flexible in their thinking throughout the day, to transfer into these spaces, to engage differently each time, and then still be prepared to transition to that last period and be just as ready to engage in knowledge building as they were at the first period of the day. I was a middle school teacher for most of my career. I did spend time teaching elementary and high school students, however, the majority of my career was spent in middle school. I was tired by the time I got to the last period of the day, and I didn't switch back and forth. Not to mention our English learners who are also trying to take in information in a language that is not their native language, translate it into meaningful information for their own purposes, do the task associated with the ask. So what did my teacher ask me to do with this information? Hold on to that, develop a response, translate it back into an output that matches what the teacher has asked for and is in English. That's a pretty considerable task for a day. And this is a student who, if they're in 7th grade, we're talking 13, and we haven't even accounted for all of the other things that 13-year-olds bring to the table. High school, we're sitting in a very much same position. Each one of these blocks represents a transition, represents a different opportunity for instruction, a different format for instruction, a different level of expectation, different content. A level of responsibility exists in high school in which the learner owns that space differently. So they may not have the structures of support that are in place, certainly at the elementary level or at the middle school level, in terms of personal readiness to engage in the lesson. Have we removed those lifts that come with being ready to learn, being in a space? Do I have all the things? Because what we are asking now for this student is starting a day with reading intervention that may or may not be connected to their English 1 class, which is at the end of the day, which has probably nothing to do with the history class that they're taking next, which we know is going to be very language heavy, very reading heavy, and if they're not reading in that space, they're having to take in large amounts of information that is being spoken to them. And folks, as a former history teacher, we get excited, we tell stories, it becomes very fast-paced. There are bullets on the screen that don't match the words that are coming out of my mouth, and now I am asking my learner to keep pace with that and to make sense of it in relationship to where I started. And what I may be saying has nothing to do with the content on the screen. So you're getting a picture of a very incoherent day for our students. And this is pretty typical for our spaces. And it's not because we don't care about our students and we don't want to build instructional days that really work to benefit and build knowledge. It's because of the nature of how we have operated within these educational frameworks to get the content, to deliver the content. This is where instructional coherence comes in. Instructional coherence means that all parts of the student experience are working together to ensure that all students have access to rigorous grade level learning. If that is what instructional coherence means, then it means that we have to consider instructional design. How are we tailoring instruction in all of these spaces to the students that we are serving? And connecting to our neighboring, our partnering colleagues who are also delivering instruction to our students. And if instructional design provides all students access to grade level work through entry points and scaffolding and utilizes those high quality instructional materials, then we know that we have to start thinking about how are we going to do that? How are we going to leverage scaffolds and access points and supports within the instruction to build the skills and knowledge necessary to engage in the task and the lift associated with the learning? That's when we get into providing instruction that works in service of these things. And instead of doing a lot of hard work that, yes, matters. It has always mattered, but it hasn't always delivered on the outcomes because it's been disconnected from the rest of the student's experience in the day. Because if we have a program, an instructional program that's working to hit all of these in tandem, then ideally we're all working together to accomplish the same goal. It doesn't mean as a math teacher now I'm teaching reading, but it does mean that I'm considering the impact of reading in my instructional content. And I'm considering where my learner is coming in position to engaging. So if I know that if my student is entering into this instructional space with limited English, I'm not changing my expectations for my students. I still want them to achieve, but I am going to begin to design structures that support them in achieving that may look different from other students who are positioned differently. That doesn't mean, again, we're lowering expectations. It means that we're scaffolding differently to make sure that every student is positioned to engage. It also means that we're having collegial, collaborative conversations that allow us to understand what's happening in these instructional spaces to leverage and build on what is in place. Our ESL teachers are founts of knowledge for our Tier 1 instructors. It is critical for those collegial conversations to happen so that they not only understand that, yes, I have an English learner in my classroom, but also how do I leverage the tools that are available to me? How do I leverage the access points, the scaffolds to better support and design instruction to work towards the benefit of moving that student's learning forward? Without those conversations, we're hoping that that happens. And we know that oftentimes it is not just a natural space that we're standing in, and it doesn't just occur. So they have to be intentional. They have to be pointedly pulled forward into spaces so that those conversations not only happen, but are then actionable. It's great for us to talk, but if the talk never leads to action, then we still stand in the same space. So how do we do all this to make sure that everything is working to function for our students' experience and their access to Tier 1 instruction? Well, we need a roadmap. And so what we're talking about today is how do we build these structures to really start to leverage all of the collective knowledge to work to the benefit of all of our students that we are serving. And it's going to start with identifying student need. I showed you earlier a picture of database decision making. And when we're talking about student need, we're talking about student need from a variety of spaces. So we've given you a question: what data do educators need to make informed decisions about students? Identifying student need in support of their unique learning needs. How do we do that? What data are we talking about? And when we're talking about data, what do we mean? Well, we may be talking about those quantitative, numerically driven assessments that tell us where a student's performance is. So we definitely need to be looking at classroom level assessments. We need to be looking at ELPA 21. What are the results of those assessments? What about those observational pieces, that qualitative data? Do I see a student engaging in social conversation? Or are they still in that silent space of just existing and absorbing? Critical information for how I design an access point into a lesson, because if I have a student who's not yet speaking to their peers, what it looks like for me to provide access and opportunity and scaffolding may be very different from a student who has moved into academic language and is producing and engaging in conversations with their peers on a level that is closer to what we had hoped to see already. TCAP data. TCAP data is going to tell you information about student performance. And I know many of you might be thinking, yes, but we know that TCAP data may not show us all the story about our students. And that's true, but it does give you some information about positioning. Where are they at with what they were able to produce last year in comparison to this year's standards and expectations? What about universal screening data? What does that tell us about students? How can we take all of this information in and then leverage it to create a picture of student performance that helps us intentionally design instruction that benefits each individual learner? It means that we have to collect a variety of data, we have to analyze those data, and we have to understand those data in relationship to the student that we're talking about and that we're making decisions for. And then we have to take that knowledge and look at our instructional materials, because those data are going to help us understand and identify the entry points and appropriate scaffolding that we're going to utilize as students engage in instruction. In your high quality instructional materials, in the teacher's guides, there are considerations for how to create access. And that may be sufficient for some students, but for other students, you may have to create more entry points. It may not be sufficient for all students. So that means there has to be a level of planning and preparation that is made and designed with each student in mind, because what is true for one may not be true for another. It may be, but you're only going to know that if you take the time to really get into the weeds of identifying student need. And that then positions the teacher and the student to better engage with these instructional materials. This is all based on systems and structures. How will we ensure educators have the knowledge necessary to create a cohesive experience? Remember, I told you it doesn't happen organically most of the time. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened organically, but most of the time, it's not happening if we're not having and engaging in these conversations intentionally to find opportunity to connect. And how will leadership build the capacity for these structures? You know as well as I do that the number one resource that we need more of and don't have enough of is time. It is a finite amount, and how do you make sure that there is time for this space, for the conversations that need to happen, to really design and leverage instruction for the benefit of our students? And then, what about learning acceleration? How will we leverage learning acceleration to better position students for engagement in Tier 1 instruction? How are we going to front load content? How are we going to pull forward key vocabulary to build knowledge? How might we re-engage with text that we know is going to be an anchor component of a lesson in an appropriate space that makes sense in time with where our students are positioned to engage with it? That means that what it looks like for each individual student is going to be a little bit different and has to be accounted for and has to be incorporated not only into the Tier 1 space, but also into how they're being supported in those other spaces. Because if we don't do that, then we continue to provide the disconnect and we ask our students to do the lift of creating the transferability of that knowledge and the generalization that comes with knowledge building. And we know that when we leave it in those spaces, it doesn't always happen. Because you all have seen working with students, engaging with them, providing them solid instruction that never quite makes it over to showing up at that grade level space. Because we didn't give them a map to take the knowledge from one space back to the other. Because it requires a whole nother level of flexibility and thinking that our students have to be prepared for and have to be taught how to do. And we have to know that they're doing it. We have to monitor that. And we have to respond to it, because progress monitoring, in the name of progress monitoring, is data collection. But progress monitoring in the name of responding is moving the needle forward in terms of instruction. So yes, we need to collect data, but why do we collect the data? So we know what the data is telling us so that we can respond in time with what we have identified as a student need or a trend in the instruction that we're seeing for all students. This is why we're talking about instructional coherence being so important. Because these connection points take the lift of this flexibility and this ability to transfer knowledge off of our students and puts it back into the intentional design of the day, so that our students are then focused on the knowledge building. And we're designing how to bridge into those other spaces. And we're intentional about that bridge. And we have had the collegial conversations that help us understand how what's happening in this classroom also is happening in this classroom, and we're talking about it in a similar way so that our students have a similar experience with that. So let's go back to our students. If we have thought about an instructionally coherent day for our students, if we have built the structures that allow for our students to engage in these spaces in a way that account for, yes, the unique feature of each one of these, but also leverage opportunities for connection, then what might that day look like? Well, for our second grader, it may mean that we're still knowledge building in planets. We may still be knowledge building in planets, but the writing experience is now talk about one of the planets that we discussed in class today. Instead of a disconnected personal experience that now I have to generate independently of the previous knowledge. And how many of you have ever asked a student to tell you, or even your own children, what's the best part about today? How was your day today? I don't know. I don't even know if I experienced a day today. So you're asking a kiddo to then generate this experience and all of this content to then write in response to, when we could go back to what we did in knowledge building and make that lift a little easier, because we just got done talking about planning. Now let's write about it. What about in foundational literacy skills? That's where we're talking about the critical components that help us decode words. We're building that basic reading foundation. How are we going to connect that to knowledge building? Well, perhaps when we're looking at sentence structures and we're applying that decoding process, maybe it's using sentences that talk about the planets. When we move into, I'm going to skip ahead to the reading intervention spaces, if in our foundational literacy skills we were bringing forward digraphs and we're talking about digraphs in that instructional space, when we move into the intervention space, we're still calling it a digraph. We're not talking about H brothers and asking a student to be flexible in thinking, especially a student who may still be solidifying language. Because that's a lot of flexibility, because that's a lot of code switching. Maybe there's opportunity in the day to bring forward some of this same information that you're utilizing in that knowledge building space into that direct service space, so that you're front-loading content, even though you're continuing to work on building language through a space that allows them to take that same experience back into their tier 1 space. In mathematics, maybe we're talking about academic language, perhaps even in the intervention space. You're going to see words that say this is what they mean, let's work on decoding. You know how to break down open and closed syllables, so let's take this word and break it down. So again, exposure. We're not saying that we're now going to be teaching true pieces of reading, if you will. We're not going to move reading text of planets into math if it has no connection, but there are ways to start leveraging instructional ideas and instructional content to create a really smooth transition for our students. What if in art They take the knowledge that they built in knowledge building, and they are, yes, learning color theory, but applying it to a planet. So again, making it accessible, building that knowledge, finding cohesion. It does not have to be limited to taking one piece of text across all spaces, but rather finding opportunities, small opportunities to lift the work of transition, generalization, and flexibility in thinking so that our students are engaging with the learning. In that middle school space, Edgar Allan Poe is very difficult to read if you are a 7th grade student. And if you are a 7th grade student who is not a native English speaker, it's going to become even more complex. It's complex for our native speakers because we don't speak the way that he's writing. If you have not read it, I promise you, Victorian English does not look like the modern books that they're reading. Okay, it doesn't look like the text messages that they're sending. And many of the vocabulary words that are presented in that text have really no direct relevance, if you will, to modern day language. Nevermore shows up in that text repeatedly. What does that even mean? So again, understanding the ask, providing access points, scaffolding, and opportunity. Then, if we know perhaps a reading strategy that we're using in the English language arts that has been very successful, can we apply it again in the social studies class where they're probably being asked to read? Or is there an opportunity for collaborating with the teacher who likes to tell stories and go off script to provide a pathway for those students to track with that knowledge? How can we start to think about, if you know that, Dr. Richardson, if you know when you start to talk about the fall of Rome, you're going to talk about how the European portion of the former Roman Empire then developed into all of these different subsets of groups of folks who then create the modern European world. Can we put some visuals in? Can you give us a map? Start having these conversations and opportunities to start building. How can we create a space that takes the lift of knowledge and makes it accessible? In the science class, can we start to use some of the decoding skills that we're working on in the reading intervention class? In the science class, can we pull forward some of the vocabulary into the reading spaces so that as we're talking about reading intervention, we're talking about vocabulary that's going to show up in science or maybe in social studies? These are strategic moves that on the surface level seem very small, that will make significant differences for our students as they start to engage in these spaces, because what we're doing is we're showing them what you're learning in that reading intervention space has a connection back to what you're doing in science or what you're doing in reading. Even if the instruction that we're providing sits very far away from the grade level ask. So if you have an 8th grade student who is being supported at a grade level instructional space that is so far away from the ask in 8th grade, how do you bridge that gap? They are still working on decoding words. In their 8th grade classroom, their teacher is probably never going to mention decoding words. They might talk about words that are difficult, unfamiliar words, unfamiliar phrasing, but they're probably not going to stop a lesson and say, let's take this word and break it down into its pieces so we can start to decode it. So how can we create that opportunity in other spaces to take it back into the reading space so it makes the reading more accessible? How can we front load an anchor text in a way that works to support language development, but also provides greater levels of access in that tier 1 space? How can we support our teachers in building greater levels of visuals and stop points into their instruction to help our students have a moment of, let me digest the information that has been pushed forward to me, internalize it, and then be able to apply it. The same thing is true in that high school setting. Intentional design shows up as one of the first and most important components of success, because we've done the work on the front side in terms of thinking about how the instructional design is going to match the learners in our instructional spaces. We know that we are all very passionate about what we do. And we know that the folks that we work with are also very passionate about what they do. And how can we take our collective knowledge to design instruction that, yes, works to meet the grade level expectation, but also provides entry points into these spaces? And that's done through leadership. And we've talked a lot about opportunity. So as leaders, you are tasked with, if you are a district level leader, with designing what it's going to look like for implementation across the district. If you are a building level leader, what it looks like in your building. And if you are at the instructional level, what it looks like within your classroom. The most critical component is that it's a cohesive, coherent, consistent message. Do we expect it? And if we expect it, what does it look like? How do we define it? And if we've defined it, when we go into these spaces, what do we expect to see? It requires the combined efforts of your core instruction folks, of your intervention folks, of your special education individuals, and your folks who are working on English language development, because all of these roles are individuals who are going to touch the student's experience, who are going to impact that knowledge building, who are going to have opportunity to push a student forward into greater levels of understanding, or if we're not aligned and we're not working in that space, perhaps be a stopgap in that process. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to pull out these instructional roadblocks that prevent our students from accessing to the greatest extent possible, because we didn't consider how much lift we are asking of our students in their days. It doesn't mean that you're still not going to have these individualized content spaces, because you are, because that's the nature of how we work. But how can we weave them together for an experience that, yes, works to the benefit of our students, but also works to help us as educators create these collaborative opportunities in instructional spaces that make it a fluid process? It may require additional time for collaboration, because if you are not already engaged in high quality instructional materials and you don't understand the rigor that is associated with those materials, or even the texts that are pulled forward in those materials, then it's going to be very difficult to create access points and scaffolding that meet that. And if your Tier 1 teacher does not understand the student who is entering the classroom and the current level of performance that that student is currently at, and how to address that and support that in the Tier 1 space, then we're already sitting behind the goal line, like far behind the goal line. So we want to make sure that we are having opportunity for these conversations and building this into our practice so that it is fluid. It's not an additional ask, it's just part of the process that we are engaged in. Which means that I have now given you a lot to think about, and you probably have a lot of questions surrounding this process. So I'm going to ask for the rest of the team to come forward so that you all can think about and ask questions related to instructional coherence. What does it mean? What does it look like? What about in this space? I have Joanne Runyon, I have Raven Cleveland, and Dr. Hannah Gribble with me, who are here positioned to answer your specific questions about English learners and about ESL.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Haley. And I do want to add to this wonderful presentation that, you know, as I think about this content and I think about the work that the state is doing around acceleration for all. So I know today you heard about instructional coherence. In the space of acceleration for all, we are starting to hit heavy on systems coherence. And so this week, I got the opportunity to be with districts specifically in the South Central region, but I know that you all had acceleration for all sessions in your different regions. And that was one of the heavy topics, system coherence. How do we set up those spaces for what Haley just talked about, that collaborative time, where we have all educators that are working with that curriculum, those high quality instructional materials that have aligned program areas to ensure that these experiences are seamless for students. And so for us, this might sit a little differently because we know that in some places, our English learners are not seen as general education students first. So we have to come at it from that angle. Our students who are English learners are students that are general education students first. ESL is part of their core instruction, that additional support they need. But when we think about our kids, even our students with disabilities, they are general education students first. And so I think this is going to have some of us have a little bit of a mind shift. And those of you that are here, that you've been working with Acceleration for All, you've made those shifts. But with some of our folks that haven't engaged deeply with this work, they may just need a little push or a little extra explanation to think about that. When we're thinking about these seamless experiences, we're thinking about access to high quality instructional materials, how our teachers plan the supports that they have. We're thinking of our students as general education students first. So anybody else want to add anything to that? No? We're ready for questions. And I think Dr. Clark has a mic there, and Ms. Jana as well.
Good morning, thank you. I know how important it is for our teachers to be collaborating, and I really, really want, I'm an ESL advisor, so I support ESL teachers. I want my ESL teachers to be in those spaces and part of those conversations, but their days are so full. And the content teachers' days are so full. So my question here is, what can we take off of teacher plates during their day to allow that collaborative time? What can we do to free up their space, like both physically in the day, but also that mental space they can collaborate?
So I think there's going to be a presentation this afternoon about how to create those collaborative spaces. See what I did there?
It's a good point, Hannah. So that is a good question. That question actually came up yesterday when I was working with several districts in South Central. It's going to start from leadership making those decisions. How are we planning for collaboration? And what are we going to have to take away? There was a district there, I'm not going to name them, who realized that they had their teachers in several spaces and several meetings. They stopped that this year. And Hannah, they were part of the roadshow. I'm not going to mention them, but they were part of the ESL roadshow. And one thing that team was telling me was that they realized they had several meetings, and so they minimized the meetings, not only district level, but as well for teachers. And they made the schedule. The adults in the central office made the schedule and set the expectation to have that collaborative time.
And that's often what it comes down to, is scheduling that space, and that takes your building administrators getting on that same page with you to figure out a schedule where teachers have that space to collaborate.
And Melissa, I'm going to add to that too, to say if we're thinking about the classroom teacher, even when we don't have those structures that are in place from our leadership, okay, we want this ideally, but right now, what can we do? Well, let's start with some of the priorities, and we can start, as Haley said, data-based decision making. Let's not just collect the data, but let's say, is this really working in our classroom? And if it's not, let's stop doing it and let's start prioritizing things that we do know make an impact in our planning. So does that mean using our high quality instructional materials in our ESL classroom? Does that mean having time to say, hey, content teacher, can I get a list of the standards that you're going to be teaching? And then maybe use my ELD, ELA standards crosswalk to figure out what language functions, what academic vocabulary, what language grammar structures can I be focusing on in that classroom. We know that vocabulary and grammar structures take 30 to 70 times to internalize, not just to know the word, but know how to use the word or know how to use the structure, use it in syntax. If we have instructional coherence, as Haley was talking about, we're providing greater than just 30 or 70. All the onus doesn't fall on the ESL teacher. It's a shared responsibility. So I think prioritization of things that are working in our classroom, and the only way we are able to do that is through monitoring, progress monitoring.
Yeah, and then it may be very difficult to get all of the folks at the table at the same time right now because your structures do not allow for that. But we, for better or for worse, live in a digital age right now. So can we have a shared space where we're dropping resources that everyone has access to? So it's not just up to me to go to Raven to ask what is happening in your classroom, but I can see it and I can access it. And then the expectation is that I'm going to do that lift and I'm going to be engaged in that way, even if I don't have the opportunity to walk down the hallway or across the building to connect directly with her. But I can send an email and ask a question, or I can access a resource and understand, okay, today we're looking at this, this, and this, and here are the suggested opportunities that Raven has provided for me to help assist with access in the classroom. And that's done via perhaps a shared document in a Google Drive or a Teams channel or whatever structures and systems your district has in place, plus an email. And I didn't have to leave my classroom to do that, but it gave me greater access. It does mean that folks who maybe we didn't think about needing access to high quality instructional materials need access to those materials. So it may mean that we have to create and click buttons in other spaces that give access to those materials. I know some of you use ClassLink to host those materials and you have to give permissions. So we may have to add permissions so that there's access in place, but those types of small moves create opportunity for collaboration that don't require, it's not that they don't require time, but they don't require us to have the same time available.
So I'm wondering if there might be folks in the room who could share sort of some suggestions of things that have worked well for your districts.
I work for a network of charter schools, and what we created was a diverse learners dashboard. And so we have all accommodations and instructional scaffolds for all of our diverse learners, IEPs, 504s, ILPs, ILPDs. And it's broken down that every teacher at each school has a tab and they're able to see it. And then on that same area, it has all their ELPA scores and any other pertinent information. So they have all that at their fingertips. And then we've created an IPP process for when they're planning that's like step one. You need to know the data of the kids in your room. That should be on your seating chart. That should be on your ACMO laps, like anything that you're doing. And then we implemented this year for our content-based instruction to make sure that co-planning is happening with co-teaching, required lesson plans. And we have like yellow parts that are non-negotiables. And that's where they do have co-planning time, but that is happening. Like we're pushing our teachers to meet weekly and everything, but no matter what, there's always a collaborative document and that is being checked. So just kind of putting systems in place to make sure all of our teachers have access, because they don't all have access to T and Pulse. So get all that information at one spot, and then also making sure they have the systems in place like lesson plans or whatnot that allows for that collaboration.
It sounds like maybe not just allows, but also holds some. There's some accountability there, right? Not just like strongly encourages, not just allows.
Two things that came to mind that we're doing in Rutherford County. Not that we can't get better at it, but in middle school, the expectation is that we have mini schools. So 4 teachers, the kids see the same 4 teachers, and those 4 teachers should have similar rules, similar procedures, and have the same planning time to be able to keep things kind of coherent. And then our high schools are now all on a 4x4 block. I know some others of you are doing that too, but I think the greatest thing about that is our high schoolers went from managing 8 different periods, 8 different transitions to 4. And I think that frees up a lot of brain space to be able to just focus on those 4 classes at a time. And then one question I had about elementary, would you suggest that a self-contained classroom is best for K-5 to eliminate some of these extra rules, extra people, extra procedures that younger students are having to keep up with?
That is a great question, and I appreciate that question. But you don't have to have self-contained to have that cohesive opportunity. You all know within your districts and within your buildings the structures that work best to promote student learning and address the needs of your students. So there may be a model where that self-contained classroom is the best approach, but there may also be a model where that departmentalized approach is more appropriate. But what I would encourage is the opportunity for collaboration, which in the elementary school setting, they have had some of those experiences, and what happens with self-contained folks is that they may not recognize and may have to be supported in creating that collaborative opportunity across other spaces. And when you're departmentalized, again, you kind of lean into your content area, if you will. So again, expanding that understanding of how we can broaden what we're talking about into a variety of spaces instead of limiting our vision for our work into those siloed structures.
Thank you. This has been really, really good. I don't want to get away from this discussion that's happening with the coherence and so on, but I want to go to a slide that Dr. Richardson had earlier in the presentation, the data-based decision making. And my question is for the team up there, but actually more for my partners in this room here, is that you've got that cycle, the define, analyze, implement, evaluate, and so on, which is great. I think we have data about our English learners coming from many sources throughout the year. However, what we bring to the table every time is one data point the whole year. We've got our ELPA scores, which are now 6 months old. When we come back to the table in November, December, they're 8, 9 months old. When we come back, it's the same data point in February. It's the same data point in May. So my question, again, this is more for the group here. We've got other tangential pieces of information about the students because we're doing universal screening. We've got CFAs, benchmarks. Those things keep going with the students, designed for the general ed population. That's great. However, we can't speak really directly to what progress that child is making as an English language learner within everything that's happening during the school year. What does this group use to kind of tap into what progress the student is making, given that we can't, I mean, it's not an official one, but it's somewhere along the way, because we won't have that next one until end of May next year, and then we have to use that for all of the following school year. Is that my question clear? Thanks.
In Rutherford County, we have created our own assessments. We've also used a platform called Extempore. I think we heard about that here one time, a few years back. And it's a great program, a great platform. You have the opportunity to use some of their pre-made assessments, but you can also create your own. So the ones that we create are based on our units that we've developed for our students. We've also aligned them with our statewide, district-wide curriculum.
I want to add too, though, if you don't have, regular language checks. Or in high school, we also use the assessments that are in the curriculum that we bought. We bought a curriculum for 9 through 12 from National Geographic. It has regular assessments, but you can also take the student work that you're using in the classroom, in the ELD classroom, and compare it to the PLDs in ELPA 21, see what level they're at, by those descriptors, look at the next level of descriptor and say, okay, they're at a level 2 in this one. I want them to be at a level 3. What's it going to take in this student work to move to a level 3? And then that can be shared. Set some student goals around that. I do think last year we were just getting our feet wet with the ELPA 21 standards, but this year we're really trying to take it to the next level using some of their other resources like the PLDs, performance level descriptors, to really look at our kids' work and see where they are and do it on a regular basis, like every 2 weeks, because we felt the same thing. We can't just operate on one data point for the entire year and one that's old by the time the school year starts.
Megan, you took the words kind of right out of what I was going to say. I'm so glad that you said that and that you're using that, because ultimately the ILP should be the driving instructional document, right, for all teachers to be using. We're not doing that right now across the board, but the ILP has those goals set, and what we're looking at is okay, we're taking a look at the ELD standard for this student, and then we're looking at those ALDs, those achievement level descriptors, which are also called reporting PLDs on the ILP, and the PLDs, and then we're saying at level 1, here's where the student is. Language-wise, where are we supposed to be? I'm also going to put a shameless plug in. Our next speaker is not speaking about that today, but she does do a wonderful presentation, and they're experimenting with micro progressions from level to level in Hamilton County Schools, Erica Rayburn, so she might be a contact or might want to say something about that. Not to put you on the spot, Erica.
I'll share something that we do at Murfreesboro City Schools. ELPA has a toolkit that you can purchase to help monitor. So we've bought that for each school. So we are doing checks on that. And then we use Hello Benchmark, which for our newcomer curriculum, and that has check marks, like checkpoints for our newcomers as well. So that's been really helpful.
I do think looking at student work to determine their progress takes a lot of training for your teachers, because it's real easy to sit in the classroom and have kids that you've had for a couple of years and say, oh, they've made so many gains. But when an outsider looks in, or when they take that ELPA, it doesn't show that. And it's partly because that teacher is seeing their total growth, not those specific things. And so it takes a lot of work looking specifically at those PLDs and performance level things to say, okay, this really is an example of this. Now let's backwards plan to get them to move up to the next thing.
A lot of that norming.
And we don't have that training yet. Like, we had, lots of you developed your own training with WIDA. We knew teachers had kind of internalized those things. We're not there yet with ELPA.
I would like to invite you all to participate, shameless plug again, to participate in our communities of practice. I know there have been several of you here. In our last one, we talked about discourse analysis and writing analysis. Simple ways to take just an interview with a student, look at the transcript, and identify both morphology, discourse, syntax, semantics for a student to say, okay, here's what this student needs right now. Both in writing and in oral discourse. So third Tuesday of every month, we listen to you 3:30 to 4:30 in the afternoon. So please join us.
And those are recorded.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've missed them last year or this year, go back and find the recordings or email Raven. She's got those.
Where are the recordings for this year?
They have not been posted yet. Yes. They are making their way on there. So we just did it Tuesday. So give us a minute to get it up there.
I want to add one other possibility. We just started this year, so I cannot tell you how well it's working. But I did get the opportunity to integrate ELD into our district-created ELA lesson plans. So I worked on high school, and one of the things that I did was I created an addendum to their writing rubrics for our English learners aligned. I used the performance level descriptors, the PLDs from the aligned ELPA standards, to create this addendum to the writing rubric. So when our teachers are scoring student writing, they can use the rubric that comes from our HQIM, but alongside it, they can also use this EL specific rubric, which will give them data about what level their students are performing at within those standards. Can't tell you how it's going, but check back with me soon.
I'm deeply curious because collecting data is difficult, and it's difficult to get it where everyone can see it, and it's difficult to pick amongst all ed tech companies. So I was like wondering what y'all are using in your districts to collect data for English learners with tech, right? Like, my school uses Achieve 3000. I know there's Lexi. I know there's Flashlight. There's all these things. And I think part of leadership advocation is knowing what's out there to ask the people with the money bags of like, hey, because I think that it's really important that we can collect accurate data, but we also don't want to push heavy lift on the data collectors, right? So I was curious.
So I'm with Hawkins County, and we've purchased Panorama, which collects all kinds of data, academic, attendance, behavior, all in one place, lots of colorful charts, graphs, ways to run reports, and we can tell the Panorama people what data we want collected. And so we just let them know what we need collected and how to get to it, and they do that for us. And it's all in one place. We use it, our school administrators, district, teachers, and you can choose who has access to what data or students to protect privacy and
I know this will be asked as a follow-up to that. Do all your systems feed to that? For example, does your student information system feed that attendance into that?
Yes.
Okay.
So our attendance feeds in. We use Skyward, and then it also feeds in the behavior piece, and then we bring in TCAP, ELPA, AIMSweb, lots of different things that it'll feed in to one place.
I feel like Putnam County is really right at the point of having, perfected instructional coherence. But with that, because we do have a seat at the table, it's a requirement that especially our elementary, that they meet at the beginning of each unit and with each grade level, and the buildings have worked well with us about scheduling and making sure they're still not losing their hour of instruction and things. So we're right there, we're on spot. But with that being said, that's opened up other areas of concern, because now, we're talking about the scaffolds, and we're talking about what they're doing in CKLA and what we can do for ESL. We use Language Studio. But with that being said, then the teachers are concerned and the admin are concerned, so they're asking us now about grading. And so that has been a hot topic for us. And so they're like, can you get more information on ways that we can grade, because we know that there's been some concerns and some bills that have been trying to be passed about grading, and the teachers don't feel comfortable. So can you guys give us some suggestions to take back to our teachers about scoring?
Yeah. So this is not going to be a favored answer. Don't boo me, okay? Grading is one of those things that the state is a guiding agency, and LEAs have asked for, and the state has said, we give you a lot of autonomy about, there are grading statutes and grading rules, right? State Board of Education rules, but a lot of the freedom comes from the LEA. So again, those are conversations that are good conversations to start having, because we weren't even talking about those things before, right? We're finally getting to this point. But it's really the leadership of the LEA that needs to come together and start addressing some of these issues with grading, to say, how are we grading overall all of our students? Are we standards-based? Are we using a traditional 100-point system based on engagement or participation? Like, how are teachers doing that? Finding out what's happening in their LEAs as far as grading goes. And then listening to teachers to say, how would getting this data benefit our instruction. So when we're talking about grading, how would changing a system benefit the instruction of our students? So that's both systems level and classroom level instructional coherence that those conversations have to take place. And it really, a lot of the privilege sits at the LEA level, not at the state level. Joanne, do you want to add to that at all?
Miss Melissa, can I plug you in here?
Sure.
Okay. So I do recommend, if you get an opportunity, Miss Melissa, you correct me if I'm wrong, I do ask if you can to visit some of the websites that Melissa's LEA has. Do you care if I disclose what LEA you were with?
Go for it.
Shelby, Memphis. When I've spoken with Miss Carol Richardson, they have done a lot of work, and I don't know who all has been involved in this work, but I'm going to guess that this is coming at district level. They have additional guidance around grading for different areas. And Melissa, I don't know if you would like to add to that, but they do have a document. And I want to say the last time it was updated, and it may have been updated recently, was maybe about a year and a half ago, when I remember I was looking for different grading policies that districts had. There specifically calls out what they're doing with English learners, and then English learners that might be, I believe, recently arrived. They're looking at all those different areas. But going back to what Raven says, there is a lot of autonomy. There are some grading that have to be in place. If you look at the high school policy, I believe it's high school policy 2.103, or there might be an attachment of a grading policy that goes with that talks about kids that need specific grading, specific data, like if they're working on Tennessee Promise and things like that, right? But other than that, the autonomy is there for you to go ahead and have those meetings with your grading committees. I don't know if that's what they're called, but the folks that are making those decisions at the table to start talking about what are we doing, as Raven mentioned, as a whole when we're looking at grading for our different students. But if you get an opportunity, I do recommend that you look at what's in place with Shelby Memphis. And I want to say there was another LEA, and it's just not coming to mind. That's the one that usually comes first because the documents are so well organized.
With Scott County. And just to kind of tag on to what someone said, in Scott County at the beginning of the school year, I met with all of the regular ed teachers and I gave them their students' scores. Yes, it was from the last spring, but it was the latest that we had. And then I had them look at each individual student and the PLDs and highlight the differences in language between their current level and what their goal level would be for that year. And a lot of teachers found that helpful just to kind of drill into what exactly do I need to accomplish with each of my students this year. The other thing is this sounds a lot like project-based learning, which I think is wonderful. And I just wondered if at the state level, if there is any initiative to kind of go that direction or any kind of help, and if some schools wanted to go towards more project-based learning.
That is a wonderful question, and that's a question that is stumping me right now. I've worked in the space, in a very small space with project-based learning with a demographic of students that we support, but I have not had the opportunity to have conversations about that for other groups of students. So we usually talk about project-based learning for students with disabilities that might be working like towards a different diploma and so forth. And so I've not had the conversation in like this type of space, but that is a good thing to take back and see where that might be.
I had just talked to, we're a small system,
yes.
So several years ago, I talked to, let's say, a fourth grade class, there's only 4 teachers there, and said, wouldn't it be great if you could decide that we're going to have this social studies lesson or this unit about the same time as this science one, and just to make those connections so that the students are learning things that are connected. They were willing to do it. and it worked pretty well. But I just didn't know. I thought it would be wonderful if maybe someone had already done that, and they said, "Here's how you can a cheat sheet." They've already done it. That would be wonderful.
I will tell you, there are some districts that are using content-based instruction as a model in both pull-out and in co-teaching. So they're using their high-quality instructional materials and then either pulling out or co-teaching to do work around whatever the topic of the high-quality instructional material is. There are a couple in the state that are doing that. I don't know that it's necessarily a project that kind of incorporates it all. But there are some similar things that are happening through that content-based instruction model.
And my last question was, years and years and years ago, before, I know we can no longer do push-in, but before then, when I was an ESL teacher, I would push in for just a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes, and sat with my students and help them and help the entire class also. But that was a great way for me to really see what was going on in that classroom. And it felt like it was a great, easy way to collaborate with the teachers. And I would push into different ones. And I just wondered if there was any discussion. We're talking about we don't want to overload our teachers and there's just not enough time. If that could be a partial solution to help them see what's going on, collaborate, working with the kids. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
At our last instructional office hours, we did have a district that said, hey, in addition to our rule-mandated ESL service time, whether it was pull-out or co-teaching or a scheduled classroom, we are providing opportunities for our teacher to provide a push-in service. Push-in is not an allowable service model, right? But having extra time to go into the classroom to support English learners in any way possible is something that's just an additional support, right? Outside of that dedicated intensive English language instruction hour or more that you're giving your students. So it's not that you can never do it. It just doesn't count as that service. They have to have that dedicated service time.
And I just thought of something as I heard you speak. What a wonderful opportunity for you to expand that access to maybe work with the gen ed teacher so that you're not having to go in individually. So if there's an opportunity for you to be part of a training at the beginning of the year, however you all set up, if you have like quarterly time that teachers have and you have that time, I think so that you're not exhausting yourself. I know you said you're a small system, but that still takes time. Instead of individually going, having some training where you can expand your knowledge of what you do so that now teachers are trying that on their own and perhaps all they're coming to you for is, hey, I'm trying to refine this this strategy in the classroom. What do you suggest? But I think expanding that use is really going to, as folks say, give you the bigger bang for your buck because you're not having to go individually. So I try to get myself into those spaces where I would have an audience to say, hey, here's what we're doing to support students, whatever curriculum you might be working with or a subject. Let's talk about what this looks like. And I'd like to see some folks, applying this and how it's working for you. Maybe next time we come together, you can talk about your successes if you've tried this, just to expand what you're doing with a small number of teachers and you see it across the schools. Yeah.
And I'm going to tag on to that because I had the opportunity to talk with Sabrina this week at Acceleration for All, but we were talking about professional learning for our teachers. And there are 5 rule-mandated trainings that have to take place. One of those is teaching our teachers about the foundations of second language acquisition. All teachers should know. And the order of acquisition, that natural order that happens for students. A lot of teachers don't know this. So finding times and ways to incorporate knowledge. We talk about training those teachers. Some people tend to do it just at one session at the beginning of the year, but how wonderful would it be, as Joanne was saying, if you had just 15 minutes to sit down with the teachers to say, let me just tell you one thing about the order of acquisition. In most languages, this is the order in which grammatical structures are generally learned. That means we're going to have to be really intentional about teaching this particular thing that we're learning in 3rd grade, reading. Breaking those up into professional learnings across the school year, or just tiny bits, nuggets of information. And again, I'm not afraid to shamelessly plug. One of the things that our communities of practice do is take a look at those language structures or those language forms that students will need to know, and how to teach teachers how to do that. But our community practices last year did that as well. We were looking at how to apply the IPG. And then our summer collaborative here at MTSU, if you want to go back and take a look, Sabrina and April and friends did a wonderful presentation of how to tie the IPG back into. So thinking about instructional practices. So as you're having those conversations, finding ways to weave in. So it's not one more thing, it's something that's coherent, right?
I'm going to jump back to Kathy's question because it was a little more about allowability of push-in. So as Raven said, you can use push-in if, one, you are not counting it as their required service time. Two, that teacher has the full lunch period that they are required to have. Three, they are getting their full planning that they are required to have by state board rule each week. So it can't push into that planning time. It has to be extra on top of the other requirements.
Dr. Gribble, I just wanted to ask quickly regarding additional supports such as push-in. Should those be listed on the ILP since they're not an official service, or do we leave them off?
It would be listed on your ESL teacher schedule.
So you want us to list it on the ESL teacher schedule and not on the ILP?
That's correct, because the ILP is for services.
Yeah, the ILP is for that required service time. But when we come to monitor you and we look at that teacher's schedule, if it says push in, I mean, I'm looking at the required service times anyway, but if it says push in, I'm looking to make sure those kids are getting their full hour, and then that teacher is getting lunch, which has to be the same amount of lunchtime as other teachers and as students, and that they're getting that required planning time each week. And I think that concludes us, Dr. Clark.
We used our time. I just kept going. Well, thank you everyone for all the great questions. Thank you for all the thoughts and all the sharing across the room. We'll turn it over to Dr. Clark. Thank you, Dr. Clark. That went by fast.